let's go.
Here we go. Well, welcome to our 6th episode of the series Ideas and Lives, or better known as the Bob and Zvi Show. Hi, Zvi. How are you doing today?
Okay, when you say better known, I didn't even know we were known at all. But we're getting there.
Yeah,
Tomorrow's
we're getting
gonna
there.
put us
Well,
on the map.
our guest today, yes, will put us on the map, is Tamar Jacoby, a public intellectual who has covered a wide range of, I would say, domestic policy topics, and is a good friend and colleague. And now Zvi's going to have a chance.
Of yours. I have
of
never
mine,
met Tamar before.
Of mine, and Zvi's going to get a chance to know her as well. But I'm Bob Lerman, a social policy economist, and we have Zvi Bodie, a
thought leader in the field of retirement finance. How's that?
Okay, perfect.
So thank you guys for the opportunity. This is going to be fun, I can tell.
Yeah.
I don't think I'm going to put you on the map, but I look forward to a fun conversation.
You never know. You never know. It's starting
Little by little.
Yeah, we're starting to. You'll certainly help us. So Tamar, you've had a long and varied career.
Let's not emphasize the long.
Well, not as long as ours, that's for sure.
Not as long as ours, but so how'd you get started into this amazing range of topics, the amazing experiences, the coverage of many parts of the US? It's not just a flyover country to you, I see. How did you get started in this?
Yeah, that's a good question and hard to answer simply, right? But I did actually have a moment as a child that I sort of look back on as the moment that really planted the seed of what I wanted to be. I don't know if I really lived up to it, but my father was a documentary filmmaker, and he knew a lot of English people. And so he used to get the magazine, which I don't know if either of you ever heard of, called The New Statesman, which was
sure.
Sort of like the New Republic back in its day, very far left, I mean, socialist left, and, came every week. My father got it to do the crossword puzzle. It had one of the hardest crossword puzzles on the planet. But I don't know how old I must have been, 12, 13, 14, I got to read the editorials. I started reading the editorials, and they were these very opinionated, very well-written British editorials that, explained the whole topic and told you how to think about it in a way that was, not assuming that you were with them, but persuading you. And I just said, I want to do that. Like, that is what I want to do. I want to write those. And I never was an editorial writer. I didn't really go that route, but somehow the idea of taking on these serious issues, explaining them, it wasn't a scholarly paper, right? It was like bringing the public along to a point of view and changing the public debate. And that just captured me as a kid. And then I meandered all around, then I didn't know what I was going to do for decades, but I do now look back on that moment. I've long remembered that moment as, that planting a seed, literally planting.
Well, the theme of creating opportunity, particularly upward mobility, seems to be a constant in what you've been doing.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's right.
Does that come from your family upbringing, you think?
No. I mean, my parents were sort of generic common garden liberals, but not, particularly political, and not particularly, I think they cared about that, but they, the real altar they worshiped at was kind of the arts. My father thought he was an artist, and and he was trying to make the world a better place too, but they were not seriously political. But yeah, I mean, I don't know where I got that. So that's.
Were you an activist?
No. I was. So now we have to tell the story. So then I was an English major. So I went to an Ivy League college. I was an English major. I also was thought sort of the imagination and arts was sort of what mattered in life. I had no idea what I was going to do. Like, why was I an English major? I did not want to be an English graduate student or professor. But then, so again, I got drawn into kind of the political debate. The people I met, I forgot all about this. This is really fun to remember. The people, so there I was at my Ivy League college, and who was sort of hanging around in the dining hall, not just some students, but two older guys who were sort of pundits who wrote about foreign policy. Somebody named James Chase and Ronald Steele. And I don't know, they were writing books there or working in the library or something. And again, they were people who wrote for the public about serious political issues. And again, I said, like, that's what I want to be. That's what I want to do. And so after college, I tried to be a journalist. And it was a long roundabout path. I can tell you all the stumbles and the whatevers. But in the end, I worked for the New York Review of Books for a long time. And then I worked at the New York Times op-ed page. And I was, again, the idea was serious. It was less like fix the world than help a sort of educate a public, understand a public debate and think clearly about it and move that debate.
What year was it when you graduated from college?
Oh my God, you're gonna have to ask me. We have to really go into this. 1976. 1976.
1976. So it was already after
Later.
Nixon.
It wasn't this, yeah, I wasn't political. I mean, the whole Watergate went on. I hardly followed it, like when I was in college. And then I was not political. So then I mean, I'm gonna fast forward and then we maybe come back to some things. But
wait, when you got to the Times, I know from our previous conversation that you were considered someone who was going to bring in people who might not be normal Times op-ed writers.
well,
And how did that happen?
no, I mean, so the op-ed page was born as a way to sort of show, I mean, literally the metaphor was show the people on the other side of give the people on the other side of the TV screen a voice. So the Times had been a place where, you know, there were editorials and there were letters to the editor, but they were not, you know, they were not taking that seriously. And it was Harrison Salisbury, legendary journalist, who said, let's create this page where we give, you know, the little old lady in Queens a chance to have her say in the paper. And by the time I got there, and I think this was partly my shaping, you know, I wanted it to be not like the little old lady in Queens saying she didn't like integration, you know, like that was, you know, not really the populist voice, but more like, you know, this is where Henry Kissinger wrote what he was going to do next, kind of. And then, you know, Norman Podhoretz answered him and said, that's not what we should do next. And then, you know, I wanted it to be sort of a debate about policy. And there was still this lingering, let the little old lady from Queens have her say, and they still do some of that. But I really saw it as a place to, you know, where the ordinary public could have a peek on the policy debate. And we used to try to edit it so that the idea was that the ordinary reader had to be able to understand the piece, like, because otherwise they would move to the sports page. But the experts also had to get something out of it so that it was worth, you know, like you were actually advancing the debate. And that was sort of the challenge, was to edit that way. But it wasn't really about, I wasn't bringing in the, you know, the untrod, whatever metaphor we're going to use, like the.
Well, what was your, can you give us one of your most interesting?
Well, I was really
had.
interested in foreign policy. So we, like it was all during the Iran-Contra and the Central American wars and all that. And, you know, one of the voices I really lifted up and published a lot were the human rights people. Like they had sort of been they were in the New York debate. The Human Rights Watch was the name of the group. And they had the Latin American Human Rights Watch and the, you know, some of the other Asian Human Rights Watch. And they had a lot of different versions of it. But they, you know, and so it became, I thought that was a really important voice. You know, again, I did, you know, I published Henry Kissinger and then published like Norman Podhoretz answering Henry Kissinger, but I also tried to bring in the human rights people. But I didn't again see that I was steering the politics. What I thought was fun about it was thinking, well, like, again, like Henry Kissinger just made this chess move. What's the next interesting chess move that somebody who disagrees with him should make? And let's like make sure that person gets in the paper. You know, so if like somebody says like Israel, I mean, I did spend a lot of time in Israel and I spent a lot of time thinking about that debate and finding people and voices in Israel to contribute. And again, thinking, well, you know, I'm forgetting these people now, but, you know, XYZ just said this. Well, the other side should be arguing that. If they're not, let's find them and say, don't you want to argue it? You know, I mean, that was the fun part.
So
right
when
after,
did
And
you,
I wasn't trying to fix the world. I mean, that was never, so that was not
so when did your desire to fix the world
Well, I
kick
don't
in.
know. So, I mean, here's what happened to me, and this is much later. We're going to have to come back to this. We're skipping over it. But, how did I go from just like being sitting at my desk typing stuff to actually playing in Washington, right? Like maybe that's a different question.
Well, it's slightly different because
You want to know when I started to care about stuff? I don't know.
Right.
I mean, so when I wrote, so I was a journalist. Let's stick with the narrative. That's always a good idea.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I worked at the New York Review. Then I worked at the Times. Then I was frustrated because I wasn't writing. I was editing other people. And so then I got a job at Newsweek. And I used to say it was exactly the opposite. Like at the New York Times, I basically wrote all the pieces or rewrote them, but other people's names were on them. And at Newsweek, it was my name on it, but some other editor actually wrote them. But whatever.
That's
I worked
snappy style.
yeah, I worked at Newsweek for a while, and then I wanted to write a book. And I had enough time, that was enough being a journalist. I mean, enough, a different topic every day. I wanted to like sink my teeth into something. And so I wrote a big book about race. And what I wrote was, what the topic was, I sort of thought of it as whatever happened to integration, by which I meant, starting to do that like in the late, when did I start? In the
Late 90s.
well, it was published in the late 90s. I started a lot longer before that,
Oh.
but took me, almost not a decade, but almost. But the idea was like not integration sitting next to each other in the school bus, but what sort of happened to the King dream that we're really one community as opposed to sort of two kind of always at odds communities or multiple always at odds communities. And I traced it in a great big 600-page book looking at 3 cities over 3 decades. So it was sort of like what happened to the civil rights movement after the civil rights movement. And that, I think I started that to be, I was also, again, sort of conventional liberal, but not that strong, not a super strong conventional liberal, just like, racism is bad and, probably like the left is good and the right is bad. Probably I had about that much political awareness. I wanted to tell a story. And, I thought racial justice was a good thing. I mean, I wasn't totally in the, whatever, clueless, but that book exploded my head because I decided what I felt I learned was that the simple black and white was not a bad metaphor. The simple right and wrong view of morality and who was right was not correct. And it wasn't like all the liberals were always right and all the conservatives were always wrong and all the black people were always right and all the white people were always wrong. It was much more complicated. And so my whole view of politics as a kind of a simple moral exercise was exploded. And then I started to question a lot of what, the sort of conventional wisdom that I'd been brought up with. Again, it wasn't that strong, but that was sort of like the water I drank, of liberal pieties. And I don't think I ever became a card carrying. I'm not a card carrying anything. I mean, a friend of mine used to joke, she's not a conservative, she plays one on TV. There have been times when I've played, I am some kind of moderate, and I probably lean a little more, in Europe, if I was in Europe, I'd be a Lib Dem. What am I in America? I don't know. I'm sort of homeless. But
Paul Samuelson used to love to describe himself as a centrist.
Well, that's sort of what I am. Yeah, I'm a centrist, and I'm a centrist who believes deeply in, sort of limited government, but some government, but achieving opportunity and achieving opportunity. That's the most important thing to me. I don't know where I got that. My grandparents were immigrants. I don't know. Where do you get stuff? Where do you get some deeply held thing like that? I don't know. I have some deeply held thing like that.
So how did you get to Texas? That's what I want to find out.
Texas. Well, let's do Arizona first. So I went to Arizona so this is the transition. So I wrote this book. I spent 10 years of my life writing this book, or 7 years or 8 years or 9 years. I don't know, it was a long time. It was a success. It was a critical success. It was reviewed on the front page of the Times Book Review, and The Economist called it the best book on race in 50 years. And I think it sold about 50 copies. So that was, but I really enjoyed writing it.
We've had that experience.
But it's still, you can still buy it. But But then, so then I got interested in immigration. That was sort of the next thing. I went from race. I'd written about race, but and all the time I was writing about race, it was all black and white, black and white, black and white. People, you'd say, "What about immigrants?" And I sort of blew it off. And then when I was finished, I said, "Well, gee, I better pay some attention to immigrants." So then I spent the next couple of years thinking about like what does it mean to be American, and immigrant integration, and what we used to call assimilation, and how does that work? And if the melting pot's gone, what is there? And so I spent a lot of time thinking about that, and wrote and edited a book about that, wrote a lot about it. And then I started to get, then President Bush and President Fox started to think about like immigration policy. So suddenly, for the first time in my life, I was actually following what was happening in Washington in policy. And I went to Arizona to write a story about a ballot initiative there. And it was going to be then cover the New Republic, and I was going to interview left, right, business, labor, faith. And it turned out left, right, business, labor, faith were all on the same side against this bad political ballot initiative, but they weren't talking to each other. And who had never done anything in politics. I'd never been to a political meeting. I wasn't the president of my class. I probably didn't even vote for the president of my class. I said, okay, I'm canceling my interviews. We're having a meeting, and we're going to form a coalition and try to beat this ballot initiative. And that's what I did. And I raised $1.5 million, and I formed this coalition, and we ran a political campaign, and I had the time of my life. And I said, like, this is really fun. Like, I would much rather be trying to make something happen than be like writing about the train wreck. You know, that sort of journalist stand aloof irony. I'm tired of that. Like, I want to get involved in trying to make something happen. So that was a big pivotal point for me, Arizona Prop 200.
And the year was?
Did you win?
No, it was 80-20 when I started, and we got it to like 45-55. And this became it was Russell Pierce. This became the evil guy in Arizona anti-immigrant politics. This was his first outing. And, you know, we couldn't stop him. But
So what did the provision say?
it denied public benefits to unauthorized immigrants. So Arizona state public benefits.
To undocumented.
Yeah.
Right. And the year was what?
2004 must have been. 2003 and 2004. So then I came to Washington. Then I said, okay, this is fun. Politics is fun. I'm coming to Washington. And I was a fellow of a think tank, the Manhattan Institute. So I didn't really have to make a living. I mean, you know, I had a living. Like, I didn't have to have a real job. And I didn't have to, I was unconstrained by, like, I didn't have any base. You know, most people need a base in politics, but I didn't have a base. But what I discovered was that, I used to use the word meritocracy. Like, McCain and Kennedy needed like a go-between, and they didn't have a go-between on their staff. They had staffers that represented them, but those staffers couldn't really talk to each other. And so somebody else who could sort of come in and help the two sides talk to each other and help come with ideas about policy. And you didn't have to have a fancy label really to do that. In fact, the more you tried to do it sort of institutionally, the harder it was. Like, if I just became the person who these people trusted and helped them talk to each other and develop policy, you could be useful. And so I played a role developing immigration reform policy for a long time. And I helped the Bush administration. They really cared about this, and they needed some people that they didn't have on their payroll that could sort of do some things. And I was the only person, again, then I started wearing the jersey of I'm a Republican, I'm a conservative, because it was useful to be a Republican and conservative in favor of immigration reform. I mean, again, not that I wasn't lying about what I believe, but it sort of became, in Washington, you sort of need a brand. I didn't need when I was a journalist. So I was the only Republican who was defending this for a long time. So I used to go on TV like every week, 3 or 4 times, fighting every time they needed somebody to fight with Pat Buchanan, somebody from the right to fight with Pat Buchanan, they called me. And so I was both like behind the scenes and in front of the scenes, sort of making this case for a kind of a centrist version of it, comprehensive immigration reform, both trying to find the legislative sweet spot and make a centrist case for it. And then Texas. Okay, this is a long story. There's too many.
This is great.
We've got time. It's a great.
You have us captured here.
Well, you're sweet. But so then comes the Texas moment. So the Bush administration. There used to be meetings where President Bush, Secretary Gutierrez, McCain, whoever it was, would bring the business people together, like the head of the chamber and the head of the Associated Builders and Contractors and the head of the Restaurant Association. And they would say, like, what are you doing to help advance this bill? Like, you care about this, you need this. You know, Bush would say, I've given 20 speeches in the last 6 months. What have you done? And they would look at the ceiling and they would say, how come you're enforcing against us? Like, could you stop the raids? So, you know, they needed a business voice, but the businesses didn't want to stand up in favor of the bill or get engaged on it. And so the first thing I did was I had a dinner. There's a fun punchline to this, not my punchline. I organized a dinner where we had some people from the White House and a bunch of these business people and some real business people, some little guys. So I had this guy who was a nursery owner from California and a few other people like that, you know, somebody from Marriott and somebody from McDonald's and somebody from the chamber and this little guy in this nursery. There were like a dozen of us around the table. And he was really eloquent at the dinner. You know, my immigrant workers, they work harder than my kids and their values are better than my kids. And, you know, they have better faith than my kids. I mean, you couldn't stop. So after this, I said, well, we should make a TV ad with that guy. So I raised money from all the other people at the dinner and we made a TV ad with him and we put it on the Sunday talk shows. Little did I know in the day that one ad doesn't get you very far, but you need an ad campaign. But we did do an ad. And then the Wall Street Journal wrote a front page story about him. So this is the joke. So they wrote the story about this guy and at the time he said, his quote on the front page of the paper was, "Now I know how Bob Dole feels." Wait for the punchline. I feel like the first man on the planet to talk about my erectile dysfunction. And I thought he just ruined, you know, all my efforts in vain. But in fact, he was right. I mean, that was a good metaphor for what he was doing and his bravery and like, you know, whatever. So
it went viral, I'm sure.
Well, they didn't have to, they would have. Immigration reform and erectile dysfunction. But so then the next thing I did, and now we're going to come to the end of the suit, I'm tired of this storytelling, but so then the Bush administration said, well, they said, we need some more grassroots employers like this. Like we need some more employers speaking out. And so I said, well, why don't, some reason we sent me to Texas. I don't know. I mean, they didn't send me anywhere, but somehow I got the idea, I volunteered. I went to Texas sort of with some advice from them, like go talk to this person and go talk to that person and see if you can find any supporters. And oddly enough, I mean, again, the quirks of life, that was the summer that they first had the TSA rules that you couldn't take your shampoo on the plane, like you had to have like 3-ounce bottles. So I got to Texas and I just like, it wasn't worth it to come back. I couldn't how would I carry my shampoo? You know, I just couldn't figure it out. I couldn't figure out like the 3-ounce bottles. So I stayed in Texas all summer and I built a coalition of business people, the heads of local trade associations who were willing to speak out. And so we called it the Texas Employers for Immigration Reform. And we were really lucky. I mean, this never happened again. I thought it fooled me how easy it was going to be. At the first meeting, there was somebody, one of them, willing to write $100,000 check. So we had like a coalition, you know, we formed something. And anyway, long story short, after that, like I built like 25 of those, like in 25 states, we had coalitions like that. And they were some of them were harder to form than others. And Texas was always one of the strongest. But, and so then I said, well, it's time to confederate. We're going to become a nation. And we brought them all together. And I started my first like national nonprofit. And that was, you know, that was Immigration Works. And I did that for a while.
Now, what about the labor unions?
Yeah, well, okay, what about the labor unions? You would ask about the labor unions. So now I have to talk about immigration reform. You're going to really take me back into my checkered past. So immigration reform, the way a lot of people think about immigration reform is that there's two components. People think there's control the border, enforcement, keep them out, and then there's make the unauthorized people legal. I call them unauthorized, not undocumented. Undocumented sort of political word. So most people think it's a trade-off between those two things. But what they forget is the most important thing, which is the third leg, which is there's a reason that we have unauthorized immigrants. And that's because our economy has changed our labor force has changed so that Americans don't want to pick lettuce anymore, and they don't want to do construction jobs, and they don't want to wait tables and a lot of things like that. And immigrants do. So you need a legal controlled flow of labor migration. Otherwise, you're going to end up with 11 million more illegal immigrants down the road sometime, no matter what kind of enforcement you put. If you have these jobs that Americans are not doing, and it's good that Americans are too educated to want to work in the fields. That's a good thing for America, but we still need somebody to work in the fields. And so that important third leg of the labor migration was what I cared the most about and what I was always trying to advance. And that's why businesses cared, and why I could bring businesses to the table, and why Republicans cared. In the day, that's why Republicans cared. But the unions didn't want that to happen, even though I don't think the AFL is not organizing, these waiters and farm workers and busboys is not the AFL's main business. And I'm not exactly sure why the AFL even anymore was against this. But so the chamber and the AFL were there was a the business side and the union side, it was a real head-to-head loggerheads. And and I don't know, they tried to fight this, and they did pretty successful. I mean, it was a hard sell in any case, controlled labor migration, but they made it an all but impossible sell. And it split the two parties because there were Democrats who got that it was necessary, and then there were Democrats who were just driven by the union, whatever. And then there were Republicans who got that it was necessary, and then there were others that were just anti-immigrant. And so, it was always splitting the coalition I was trying to put together was always center and split two parties and trying to find a sweet spot. And there was a famous negotiation in the Gang of Eight bill in 2013. I did this for a long time, right? There were a lot of bills, like bills started in 2005, and they were still doing bills like almost 10 years later. The Gang of Eight bill, we did sit down in the room with the unions. So Schumer said, I'm not going to decide this for you or find the sweet spot. You guys have to negotiate yourself. So the chamber and the unions had a negotiation, and I was in the room, and it went on, for months and months and months. And I don't know if you're a strong union man or whatever, but the unions, they're like Stalinists to argue with. I mean, whether or not they're right, they're trained arguers. They're trained negotiators.
Well, I know it from the retirement side, pension.
Right. So, because you would have a negotiation, you'd think you'd gotten somewhere, and you would come back the next time and you'd say, well, we got here, and they'd say, oh, no, we didn't give up anything. So honestly, they negotiated circles around the chamber. And the guest worker provision that ended up in the Gang of Eight bill was it was so small it wouldn't have made any difference, basically, because the AFL got what it wanted. But anyway, those are some of the battles. This was some of the battles along the way.
So you think, just to be nail this down, you think that in the presence of an agreed guest worker component that both sides could get behind, we could have had immigration reform?
Well, I don't know if that was the main sticking point. I mean, there were so many. I mean, in the end, I think that's the most important component. I think that's the fix that matters. I think the other things are sort of band-aids. But, as Bush used to say, a guest worker program would take the pressure off the border. The enforcement wouldn't be that hard. And it would mean if you did a legalization once, you wouldn't have to do a legalization again. It's the root cause of the problem. I'm not sure it was the hardest thing to get through. I mean, honestly, in the end, I think what happened was both sides realized it was more useful as a political wedge issue. I mean, all my time in Washington, I've always said, the thing I always revert to is LBJ asking Congress, do you want a bill or do you want an issue? And a bill means a solution, negotiated compromise solution, and an issue means a wedge issue. And I think, Democrats realized that they could go for, they get elected for 20 years saying those Republicans are racist, they don't want to solve this. And Republicans realized they could get elected for 20 years by appealing to racists and whatever. And I mean, I got out of the field around 2013 when I just realized it was becoming a shouting match. And the both sides, I mean, to me, people who say not one more, which means not one more person forced against, not one more person deported. I mean, that's ridiculous. Of course we should be deporting people, versus somebody on the other side putting people in cages. I mean, it's just not, neither side is serious and neither side's trying to solve it. And I saw my job as sort of like helping the brain surgeons, like there were some brain surgeons that were trying to craft policy and we were like in there paying attention, and fine work. And what I think is happening now is like you have the two surgeons like shouting slogans at each other. I mean, nobody's doing the brain surgery. And so that's when I just decided like, I don't need to play, this is not my issue anymore.
So when did you transition to?
So I started in 2013, 2014, I started to say, I'd always seen immigration as a workforce issue. And as you say, opportunity and mobility in some way has always been the thing I cared the most about. And so I sort of said, well, let's do that. And I'm a little bit of I was going to say that I was going to use sort of dilettante. I'm driven by my restlessness, so I get restless and then I do something a little different.
Well, one could say you're not in favor of butting your head up against the wall.
Yeah. Immigration, I spent 15 years of my life on it and it only got worse and worse and worse and worse.
Right.
And I came to Washington.
We won't say it's a cause and effect.
Well, exactly. A very distinguished career, right? Effective career. But the other thing is, I came to Washington at the time when there still were vestiges of bipartisan policymaking and deal making. And, Kennedy and McCain couldn't have been more different. And they were both committed to making this deal and they worked really hard at it. And they weren't the only ones. There were, there were various bipartisan deal makers over that period. But I saw just all through my time, every minute sort of, it was like the minute ago was the golden age of bipartisan deal making. And now it was getting worse and it kept getting worse and worse and worse. And I'm reading, this is probably not a book either of you have read, and it's probably not a book anybody in your audience will ever read, but I'm reading John Boehner's memoir of his time in Washington. And it's a really good book because A, he wrote it as opposed to like some ghostwriter, but B, he really chronicles this from his side, the Republican crazies taking over and the end of the deal making and sort of from the inside and the end of the people who wanted to solve things and knew that to solve them, you sort of had to do it in quiet, like ultimatums on TV to the other side is not really the way. And, and they're gone.
He's kind of a tragic figure, Boehner, because he really had to behave contrary to his character.
Yeah, well, he did, but he kept his character. He's fine. He's
well,
he strutted his moment on the stage, and
right.
He avoided. And what's tragic is the country is the decline. Is where are all the deals that used to be made, and frankly, Kennedy played a role in a lot of them. No Child Left Behind, and McCain, Kennedy, what they didn't do, but they tried, and going back a long time, 50 years, right. They knew how to compromise in Washington for the good of the country, and we don't know how to do that anymore. No one even thinks it's a good idea, and they make a show of it. I don't know if we want to talk about politics, but we're going to have this infrastructure bill that's this little Potemkin village of compromise. Meanwhile, on the other side, right at the same time, this bill that's a total partisan ram it through is going on. And not that my side doesn't do partisan ram it through too, but it's just the
guy who epitomizes the difference between the old and the new is Romney, because there was Romney governor who pushes through breakthrough healthcare, and then he argues against it when he's running as president.
Right. Well, I think we all, this is a lot of people have views about this and talk about it. I'm not going to say anything original, but it's some combination of the gerrymander district and people move to neighborhoods where, they're not integrated socioeconomically integrated neighborhoods anymore. And the media, is all, nobody reads. I don't read the same thing that people who disagree with me read, or listen to the same thing that people who disagree with me listen to. And it's just, and the people, human beings are human beings. And so they've exploited it.
Well, let's now turn to the opportunity side.
Yes,
And
this is where Bob Lerman comes into the picture.
That's where we meet and get to know each other.
Yeah, when did you
and
meet? You
We
two?
met about probably 2013, something like that. I was, I started to study this field, and who kept coming up but Bob Lerman. And so I called him up, I think, and said, can I meet you? Or I want to come get some advice from you or something. And I went to see him at the Urban Institute, the old Urban Institute. I forget what pretext it was, but I came to meet you and we talked, and I wrote a paper that quoted a lot of you, and I don't know, and we sort of met. And you were nice to me. Here I was, a brand newcomer to the field, and with nothing under my belt. And Bob was nice to me and generous, and
and we put her on a program, and we had our transatlantic apprenticeship forum, and Tamara would chair some sessions, and
yeah,
you should say what the thing is, right? Apprenticeship.
Well, yeah. So Opportunity America,
from your perspective.
My perspective, yeah. So Opportunity America, we think of ourselves as well. Let's see. How do I tell this?
let's go back. The thing that we talked about together was workforce stuff, but I was emphasizing apprenticeship. But
and
her
so
institute
Opportunity America thinks of itself a little bit broader than workforce. When we started anyway, we thought we would do some other issues. We thought we would do like home ownership I was interested in, and immigrant entrepreneurship period I was interested in. We don't really do that much of that. We do 95 point something percent workforce. And workforce is a really exciting, education is a really exciting field right now. I think partly because like automation has been, coming on us for these 50 years. It's not just starting now. And so the demands for the workforce, which again is sort of related to the way I thought about immigration, right? The demands for what kind of workers we need are changing. And so people are suddenly realizing you have to change how you educate people to keep up with that. And so apprenticeship is one aspect of it, but I'm also interested in community college workforce education, and even like what happens in high school, I did some work on for a while, and I'm interested in sort of other aspects of it. But I see the field, I run a tiny nonprofit, right? Like I only have so much influence, but I see my group as sort of a catalyst. And I see the field, my metaphor is it's sort of like Silicon Valley in the like 70s or 80s, like the late 70s or early 80s. There's all this innovation going on, but it's only the 70s or 80s. And there's still more innovation to happen, and more scaling, to the point on apprenticeship, and more sort of shakeouts of the innovations. And so we try to be strategic and pick places where we can sort of plug in and help advance that innovation. And it's like we find the better mousetraps and we lift them up, or we find the people who are making the better mousetraps and we bring them together, or we try to make policy for the better mousetraps. And apprenticeship is a big piece of it, but Bob and I often argue it's the only piece of it for Bob. For me, it's one piece of, several tools, several options, several methods.
But one other interesting thing has to do with the sustaining of your industry coalitions. Maybe you could tell us about that, because that keeps you in the legislative.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, we are a
area.
C3 and a C4, as they say in the nonprofit world. A C3 is a scholarly or educational organization that gets foundation grants, and a C4 is a political actor. And we have a coalition of trade associations that care about workforce training, and we meet with staffers, and we have input on bills, and we write letters to the Hill, and the trade associations are all the big trade associations, except for, the Chamber, the Business Roundtable, the National Association of Manufacturers. They don't play with others, but we're a lot of the other big trade associations, all the kind of construction firms, hospitality, anybody who cares about less skilled, middle skilled, Bob's term.
So that's
middle skilled worker.
Building on those is sort of a legacy of your past.
Of my past, exactly. Coalitions and policy.
Right. Probably some of the same people.
It's all the same people.
Yeah.
And back in the day when I was doing immigration, they thought immigrants were the answer to their problem. Now they think training is the answer to their problem.
Well, that's what you're telling them.
The other thing I do which is sort of related, is I'm a big believer that a group of voices is more powerful than one voice. And as much as I was like being a writer and I still like writing stuff, I think it's more effective if you can get a group of people saying it. So I've sort of made a specialty of these what you were just the interview you were listening to about that working group on the working class, bringing together a group of people to kind of hash out a position on something and getting them to kind of then sign it. Write a big paper, sort of a manifesto kind of paper, and then signing it. And that's sort of become that's a role I like, which is related to like running coalitions. It's sort of like trying to build a constituency for something, only in that case, kind of an intellectual constituency.
Why don't you tell our audience about the coalition relating to I guess it was what, AEI and Brookings, or
AEI and Brookings. So this was an idea.
American Enterprise Institute, sort of right of center, and Brookings, an older left of center.
And this idea of this working group, I didn't make this up. This was pioneered by Jonathan Haidt, the NYU psychologist, who has been concerned for a long time about the polarization of American politics. And it was his sort of inspiration, get a group of people together, find common values, and then try to agree on some common solutions, and then write a big paper. And AEI and Brookings did it first for poverty. So they had a bunch of scholars and they spent a year and they wrote a big book that Jonathan Haidt sort of midwifed, for want of a better word, probably not the right gender metaphor, but you get the idea. So then I came along, I said, let's do it for the working class. So it was not only Brookings and AEI scholars, but they sort of co-sponsored it. And it was a bunch of scholars on the right and the left. And it was right at the time, it was right at the time that Trump was talking about the working class. I mean, I tried to get this started before Trump, but then when Trump came and, got the working class vote all excited, everybody suddenly was interested in this. So here were we, the bipartisan experts, who were going to come up with a real policy for the working class, as opposed to the slogans for the working class. And we spent a year and we wrote a book, and, and it got attention. David Brooks wrote a column about it, and we had a meeting with Ivanka Trump. It was all a lot of fun. I mean, did it change anything? I don't know. Did it help any working class people? I don't know. I mean, that's the trouble. That's what concerns me. I mean, let's go back. So the arc of my career, right? Like when does what you write matter and change something? Or when does the people that you bring people together and try to do something, when does it change something really? And if I'd written editorials for some magazine all my whole life, that probably wouldn't change that much either. But, who do you write for and how do you influence things? That's deep down what I sort of care about. And how to, a metaphor that I think about a lot is the Overton window. So, the Overton window the idea is that at a given time, a certain set of policies are acceptable, and that other policies are off, beyond the pale. So, 10 years ago, gay marriage was totally not in the Overton window. And the Overton window shifted so that suddenly gay marriage was completely at the center of the Overton window, completely possible and doable and whatever. And so I think, what I think I really would like to do in life is to try to shift the Overton window around ideas. And it's, that you have to do that in different ways. Sometimes it's scholarship, and sometimes it's lobbying, and sometimes it's journalism. And, but that's, to me, what's sort of interesting is can you kind of shift what the public can take seriously to be for? And that's what I was trying to do with immigration. I mean, the meetings with the politicians were fun, and important. And sometimes legislation is what shifts the Overton window. But ultimately what you need is a general public acceptance of the policy so you can get it through. And I think, workforce is a little different, but there too, what can you, I mean, there the Overton window is really about four-year college is the only way. We're shifting that Overton window, and you shift it both by saying that four-year college is not the only way, but also by showing that four-year college is not the only way, and developing and scaling policies.
I've never heard the expression Overton window before.
It's some guy, some man called Overton made it up. It's in
I hadn't either.
I think he's in somewhere in Michigan, some think tank, but people use it in political.
And what does it mean exactly?
Well, again, it's the window. It's what's the plausible, what's a plausible policy idea at any given moment. Something that has a chance of garnering public support.
Oh, I love that idea.
Isn't that yeah? It's a really compelling.
That's
idea.
very useful.
Yeah, it's a really compelling idea. Yeah.
Really
well, cool. I want our listeners and viewers to know that Tamar is also participating in on-the-ground activity to actually change the world on the ground, small numbers so far. But she's making a great contribution to projects to expand youth apprenticeship and apprenticeship more generally.
Thank you.
How does that feel?
That's a compliment from you, Bob, is always highly
Well,
proud.
compliments will get you everywhere.
Exactly.
But specifically, what is he referring?
Well, Bob has a big Department of Labor grant to help employers launch apprenticeship programs for young people. Bob supports apprenticeship generally, but these are what they call youth apprenticeships. Not that different from adult apprenticeships, but they're for younger people. 18 to 23, is that right?
Yeah, that's enough.
So that's hard to do. So apprenticeship is, now I have to tell Bob why apprenticeship is good. This is really, how'd you get me in this position? Apprenticeship is the gold standard of training. There's no better way to train than an apprenticeship, but it's hard for a lot of employers. It's expensive. They think it's expensive. They think it's, more trouble than it's worth. They think especially the part that has to do with getting the government to approve your program, it's called registration, is more trouble than it's worth. And so there's a lot of people out there in the world trying to help employers, encourage employers, light a fire under employers, assist employers, pay employers to start apprenticeship programs. And Bob is doing that. And I'm part of the team that's trying to help him do that. And I think that the way I've sort of carved out my little role on that team is that I've gone to these associations that I know because I know them, that always makes it easier, but also because I think that they can bring a scale that an individual employer can't. So, you can get even a small company or a big company to start an apprenticeship program. It's still only one company. But if you get one of these trade associations to start an apprenticeship program and become kind of the promulgator of the apprenticeship program, suddenly you're at a whole different scale. But you have to help them do that because they don't necessarily know how, and it's not that easy. And it's, the metaphor is like the army, like they have to promulgate a bunch of practices, like so that the people who run the apprenticeship programs right. And so helping them we've been working with a couple trade associations and helping them get,
that seems like the way to do it. Yeah.
Yeah.
No wonder you treasure Tamar, Bob.
That's right.
She's your secret weapon, not so secret
Absolutely,
now.
absolutely. So Tamar, I'm wondering whether you would be willing to weigh in on this big issue that's confronting the country called race and the changing. How do you see things that have changed? Let's view it descriptively rather than normatively.
Yeah,
that was your first book.
That was my first book. So the first thing
book.
that I think is important to say, and people will not like me for this, but there's been sort of unbelievable progress. Even in my lifetime, right? Like, so I was born in 1954. Look at America today, compared to 1954, like unrecognizable as far as race is concerned. And I think that doesn't mean we've done enough. There's still a lot to go. So, I mean, it's like the left is right that there's still deep reservoirs of prejudice and structural whatever. I'm not sure what structural racism means, but deep reasons that the world isn't fair. And the right's right that we've made a lot of progress. And to me, the challenge is that some of the troubling things is that instead of feeling like we're working together to fix it, it's sort of become a cudgel all too often. I mean, not always. Sometimes we are working together to fix it, but it's also become a cudgel. And I'm very troubled by the way that I hate the Texans, the people that are saying you can't teach critical race theory, but I also hate the people who say that only critical race theory is the only way that you can view the world. I mean, and that if you don't subscribe to critical race theory, you're an evil person. I mean, I think
I'm not sure what do you mean by critical race theory?
Well,
I'm
that's
not sure what it
yeah. Well, I
means.
mean, there's a body of thinking that talks about. I mean, I don't want to have to explain critical race theory because I'll get it wrong, and I won't explain it properly.
Well, I can say a little something because I just read Randall Kennedy's critique of it that he wrote in 1998. But a lot of it has to do with authenticity. Can a white person really feel and be able to talk about something relating to blacks? And the critical race theorists would say no. And
Oh, so
you
you
know,
have to be
there's-
black to talk about the black condition?
yeah,
Well, I mean, I
and
think, but what I would say is critical race theory has now become something that means many different things to lots of people. It's like sanctuary cities, to go back and use a metaphor from my past. You know, sanctuary cities to some people was a very fixed legal thing, and to other people it became a metaphor for a lot of awful things. And so, you know, I think people who say that, I mean, I think at its heart, critical race theory, they're saying that there is this thing called systemic racism, and that the world is still, we're not finished yet. I mean, there's a good version of this, and then there's a bad version which says you can't think the opposite. White people can't think about race. If you don't think that systemic racism is the most important thing in America, you are a racist. Sort of like that. And you know, if you're not with us, you're the enemy. I mean, that's the poisonous part. That's what I mean. You know, I was thinking the other day that somebody asked me, and I've thought about it for several weeks. Like, are things worse today than they were, like, you know, when I wrote my book, like when 20 years ago? And I think the things that are, I think this, you know, I see it as a new McCarthyism. Like, if you're not, you can't be against the conventional wisdom of the moment, or you're racist. And I mean, that's just, you know, I mean, I don't like the people who are trying to ban critical race theory. That's not the right answer either, as I said. But I don't think you can have I don't think there's anything political in life that this is if you don't think this, you're an evil person. You know, that just can't be that. I don't subscribe to that. And the other thing that I'm deeply troubled by, that I saw when I looked at race 20 years ago, is the effect on children of telling them that they're not growing up in a fair society and that they'll never have a shot. That, you know, you're always going to have to be like somehow second class because you're black, and they'll never give you a chance. And I just think that's a poisonous thing to tell a child. You want to tell
So if you are a believer in critical race theory, if that's how you educate your
well,
child?
again, I mean, I wouldn't know, but I mean, I think that's part of what's being said to children now. Is I mean, they say we're making our children strong, this and this, but they say America is fundamentally a racist place, and therefore you will always be at a disadvantage. And I think, you know, the proponents of this would say, and we're teaching our kids how to overcome it, but there's some level at which you're teaching your kids they'll never overcome it. You're fighting, it's going to be you against the nature of America. And at some level, it's always going to win, and you're always going to be on the downside, you know.
So let's take someone like Tallahassee Cates, or whatever his name is. I can never remember his name. Who wrote that book saying he had to explain to his son what not to do so as not to be killed by a white policeman, or something to that effect. Is that what we're talking about?
Well, no, again, I think we're talking about, this is where I think this conversation is a little imprecise, because I think we are sort of talking about a kind of an ethos on the political left that has an attitude toward race that's not exactly the same as critical race theory, technically, you know. And I can't really sort them out intelligibly on this conversation without like thinking about it a little more.
Okay.
But I think what I'm sort of talking about is the tenor of the well, I'm in a group with, I'm running well, no, I can't talk about it. I'm sorry, I can't. I get mad at the people in the group when they talk about the group outside the group, so I can't talk about the group. But I mean, it's the same as what we're talking about, I think, in the general politics, that people see the other side as evil now. And if you're, you know, there's a certain group of, conventionalism among people politically active, aware people of color, that if you're not with them, you're evil. And there's a certain, I think, view, like on the people in the Texas legislature who think that critical race theory is, poisonous, and that's evil. And I don't know. I'm sort of backing away from it, I guess, here in this.
Well, the first thing that you said is really the way I experienced it also. I mean, I was born in 1943, and I remember, what it was like in my neighborhood, a pure white neighborhood in Brooklyn. If a Black family was rumored to be moving in, whoever was thinking of selling a house to them would have their tires slashed. I mean, it's so different today.
So different. And I think there's a way that's not being acknowledged, right? I mean, there's
the progress is not being
acknowledged. And that doesn't mean it's enough. I mean, I'll buy that. That doesn't mean it's enough. But right. I think we've been trying. Yeah. I mean, that's
like Steven Pinker has come under criticism. He's now viewed as a conservative because he says things aren't as bad as the radical left says they are.
And it's this labeling of the others. Again, he's now, it's not just he's viewed as a conservative, he's viewed as evil and unacceptable. That's what I think is the biggest poison.
I agree.
I mean, let's leave the issues aside, almost aside. I mean, there's a grain of truth, or more than a grain, in that the country hasn't solved its racial problems. I mean,
I'm trying to process all this, and you guys know I'm from Indiana, and when I go to Indiana in the South Bend, and people don't talk about this stuff. I mean, I'm just wondering how much of this really penetrates regular people who are going about their daily lives.
Well, I mean,
it affects them when they vote. It affects them, in certain circumstances relating to school boards now, and that sort of thing. But have we really polarized everybody?
Well, I'll say this. I mean, there are a lot of different layers to this, right? I don't think there's anybody Black in America who doesn't sort of think every day about being Black. Like, I mean, for good or for bad or whatever, like something happened, it's because I'm Black. And I think white people, it's long been easier for white people to say, oh, let's be colorblind, than it is for Black people. I think that's true. It's much easier for whites to say that than Black people to say that. And I think even before critical race theory, a lot of Black people, again, maybe all Black people, again, in a way that, like, I don't think that often about, like, I'm Jewish and I live in a not Jewish world or not Jewish country.
But you're talking to two guys who talk about it all the time.
Well, right. But I mean, I don't think too often, like, where, I mean, I think a lot about times when people did have to think this, but where am I going to go and who's going to help me when the bad happens? I mean, I don't worry too much about that. And I think more Black people do more of the time. Like, I'm aware of, I'm living in a country that's, and so that's, whether or not they're politicized, I think that's true. They're aware of being Black in a country that, is, even if it's gotten better, is not perfect, and, whatever. So that's one thing. But on the other hand, I think, I'll say one other, then I think the polarization, there were a lot of books for a long time. I'm going to come back to race in a second, but I think the general polarization, there were a lot of books for a long time that said, well, it's the elite that are polarized and not the ordinary people. But the elite does have a way, the elite views through politics, now through social media, of creeping down to the ordinary people. I mean, I used to do a lot of focus groups on immigration, and they all knew the slogans of the anti-immigrant groups, your average public, like the polarization does have a way of spreading when that's the point.
My God, look at January 6th.
Well, yeah, exactly.
Who was there?
Who was there? It wasn't
there.
Yeah. But so then, and so now here's a third little thing to look at in this answer. Look at New York Black voters and the recent mayoral election. Like, who do they end up voting for? I mean, Eric Adams, I'm a little skeptical of Eric Adams as a person. I think he's a bit of an empty suit and more of a showman than he is substantive, but he's a Black man who was a policeman, who's in favor of policing and who's in favor of charter schools. And he got elected by Black people. He did not get elected because he got elected by middle-class Black
And working
people,
class whites.
working class Black people who are saying we, never mind that defund the police stuff. Like, we live in unsafe neighborhoods and we need police. And it doesn't mean that they're not, I don't think they're reading critical race theory, but it doesn't mean that they're not sympathetic. When they hear critical race theory and they hear, well, systemic racism, they probably say, yeah, systemic racism. I don't think they refute critical race theory. I don't think they exactly know what it is, but I think they are also pragmatic. And I mean, the trouble is that in most elections, there's no pragmatic candidate to vote for anymore.
Right.
Well, as a final thing, let me just remind everybody that Americans elected Barack Obama.
Well, no kidding. And Barack Obama used to say, there was one famous meeting where there were Black activists and they were saying, we need a voice. No one listens to our voice. So, we have to get a voice. And he said, you're sitting in the Oval Office talking to the president of the United States.
Exactly.
Well, I think if you look at Joe Biden's success as well,
because people thought he was a centrist.
First and foremost,
Right.
With the South Carolina African-American community. And I think they certainly played a very big role in many states.
Yeah, right.
In electing President Biden. But anyway, I think we're going to have to.
I do think the thing that's important on the race thing to say, I mean, I did say it a few times, but I just want to say it again, basically, is I don't like the current debate. And I think there's a sort of McCarthyism to some of the charges from the activists. But I also think America still has a lot work to do on race, despite the fact that it's much better than it was when we were kids. I think it's going to take both sides. I mean, that's my concern. I think it's not just about white guilt. It's about what's wrong in Black communities and Black crime. And there's a lot of work to do still. And to be complacent, I mean, that's what's, again, so sad. It's like the immigration wars. It's like, instead of fixing it, having the brain surgery, we're having the two people shouting slogans at each other now.
Well, happily, we are doing some constructive work that does have a bipartisan support and making apprenticeships expand in the U.S.
I knew you were going to end this on apprenticeship.
And that would widen opportunity not only for African Americans but for all Americans. So
when I'm going to tell one last joke. One last joke. When I introduce Bob to people, I tell the story that before, now apprenticeship is popular, a lot of politicians, whatever. I've known Bob for 10 years. The joke about Bob was always, how long are you going to talk to him before he brings up apprenticeship?
Unfortunately, my wife says the same thing.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much.
No, thank you. That was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much.
It's been a lot of fun.
Great. This was educational for me.
Oh, it was a lot I had a good time. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Congratulations on an amazing career.
Oh, I don't know.
Let's keep it going.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you both.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Let's see, stop. Here, what do I have to do?
We lost you.
And the recording.